Hello again, Blender heads, and welcome to Chapter 6 of the Sculpting Scorbunny series. In this lesson, we're going to be posing Scorbunny into roughly this pose over here. Now, usually if you were going to go to the effort of posing your character, you would build a skeleton and rig them. But rigging is a fairly lengthy task, and maybe all you want to do is put your character into a single, simple pose. Or maybe you don't quite have the time for rigging. So what would be really nice is if we could use some of the sculpting tools to just put him into a pose fairly quickly. And with some of the new tools that have come out in the more recent versions of Blender, that's now much easier to do. So that's what we're going to be looking at. Now, initially when I came up with this tutorial series, my plan was to use the new pose brush tool that's come out in some of the more recent versions of Blender. But after playing around with it for a couple of hours, I've come to the conclusion that the pose brush tool kinda sucks.
I think the first thing I want to do is try and rotate his feet. Rotate these, and that's going up his belly a little bit too far. Possibly missing a little bit of his foot there, but oh, his feet have kind of splayed off to the side there. That's a strange angle for them to be at. Okay, let's undo that. Every time I hit undo, it resizes the brush, which is really frustrating. Okay, so that was a flat plane. Oh, and you can see he's still got a ridiculous angle. Okay, let's undo. Now, the cool thing here is that you do have the option of going to your brush and adding an extra segment. So this is cool. I should be able to move both his shoulder and his elbow at the same time. If only I can... There we go, that's not too bad. Oh, we're getting too much of his belly there, so let's shrink that down a little bit further. Okay, there we go. So let's try and get his hands on his hips. There we go. Let's get in there, and I want to rotate the hands the other way. Okay, let's try going from the back maybe. Maybe I can get it to work from the back. There we go. What about this? Okay, well, that's good for putting his hands behind his back. Good way. Like, I just want to get his fingertips on his hips there. All right, let's try getting the ears to work. So okay, that's not too bad. I can get a little bit of a bend in there. They seem to work reasonably well. Okay, what happens if we go and add a few more segments? Let's try this here. Okay. There we go. So let's pull that out to the side and... Okay, that's not too bad. Oh god, I'm starting to lose control. If I move that really slowly... Yeah, I can kind of get the ears to work. Ears aren't too bad. I mean, we do end up with a lumpiness, but that's not too bad. Weird little kink going backwards there.
Now, to be fair, I kind of tested this brush on some more humanoid characters with, more regular proportions. And all of these things made it much easier to use the pose brush, but I have basically given up on it. So instead of using the pose brush, we're going to use some of the new masking tools that have come in some of the more recent versions, and we're going to be using more of our traditional move, rotate, and scale tools, which are now active in pose mode. So before we start putting Scorbunny here into his final pose, there's a couple of little housekeeping things that we need to do. So first of all, make sure that you've got your scene saved as a new scene, because we're going to be applying some modifiers here, and there's no easy way to undo those. And we're also going to be merging some geometry just to make the posing just that little bit easier for us. So I'm just going to go into solid mode here. And the first thing that I discovered was, let me just turn on my wireframe here. I kind of need about this level of detail to get a good sculpt, and at the moment most of that detail is coming from our Subdivision Modifier. So if I turn that off, this is the level of detail that we've actually got, and it's not quite enough. So we really want to apply this modifier, but one of the problems that I ran into was, if I just turn on, where's like the chest? Okay, that'll do. That's not the chest, but you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. If I apply the Subdivision Modifier, it completely messes up our fur. If I just turn off overlays, you can see that he's missing this big chunk out of his cheek now, and everything's just kind of gone bad. So if I undo that, and let's re-enable that fur. So that's happening because each of our vertices in here has a number associated with it. So, this one might be vertice number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to however many we have, 4,251. And when we go and apply this Subdivision Modifier, it goes and reorders all of our vertices, which then screws up our fur. Our fur needs to know which vertex it's attached to know where it needs to sit on the body. So I thought, well, if we delete that, that's kind of nice. Our fur still stays where we expect it to. Maybe I can add one at the end and go and apply that, and unfortunately we get the same problem. The fur just kind of goes peculiar. And it doesn't matter whether we use the subdivision surface or whether we use multi-res, we run into the same problem. Fortunately, and I've got no idea why this works, but I'm very glad that it does, if we go into edit mode and select all of our vertices and subdivide there, and I'm actually going to go with 2 levels here, and just crank up our smoothness a little bit. You can see that it gets a little bit lumpy. If I drop back out into object mode, you can see that our fur has, for some reason, stayed where we expect it to. I have no idea why subdividing in edit mode versus adding a modifier works and one doesn't, but I'm very glad that I didn't need to redo all of the fur. Now, one thing that I have found that using the subdivision inside edit mode, it doesn't smooth it quite as much. We're kind of getting a little bit of lumpiness. So I will just also go and add a smooth vertices to this and set our smoothing to 1. And let's just maybe repeat this about 3 times. And you can see that just kind of smooths all of our vertices out a little bit more like a subdivision would give us. So that's given us a nice mesh to work with. Now this will be a little bit easier to sculpt. I'm going to go and turn off our fur again because that just kind of slows things down a little bit. Now the next thing that we need to do is, while we're in sculpt mode, we need to make sure that all of these pieces of geometry are going to follow along. So you can see if I just drop into sculpt mode and use the grab tool here, if I go and grab around the eyes, you can see that the eyeballs don't follow, and we're going to have similar problems with the band-aid and a couple of other things. So easiest way I've found to get around this is to just, at least temporarily while we're just posing here, is to go and merge all of this geometry into one. So to do that, we probably need to apply all of our subdivisions. So I'm just going to go through and quickly do that and make sure we do still have the membrane and the actual inner eyeball here. So make sure that you're applying the modifiers to all of those. And I'm going to do the same thing here with our band-aid. And just make sure that you apply them from the top to the bottom, because if you go from bottom to top, you can sometimes get some strange results. So with that done, I'm just going to select all of these, select that final mesh there, and go Control J to merge all of those. And once again, for some reason, adding these extra pieces of geometry and again, changing our vertex count doesn't screw up our fur. So again, very happy that that worked. Now I have had some slight problems trying to get this neck jewel piece here to work well with sculpting. So for now, I'm actually just going to go and hide it and disable it, and we may need to add that a little bit later. So with that done, we're just about ready to start sculpting. Now, while we're sculpting Scorbunny here, there's a couple of things that we want to keep in mind. The first is silhouette. Now, the whole theory behind getting a good silhouette is, as you can see here, if you were to cut out your character and then just go with a black and white image, you would still be able to instantly tell who this character is. And you can tell just by looking at this that he has some fairly distinguishing features, the little tufts coming out of his cheek, the ears, etc. Like, you can tell looking at this dude that he's a rabbit, and you can tell that he's not, say, Bugs Bunny, for example. He's a different rabbit character. And that's because the silhouette is really nice and really quite readable. All of his defining features are coming through quite strong. The only thing that I feel like could actually be improved on this silhouette, you can see down here where we've got his hands on his hips, you can tell really easily that this is his arm and his palm there is resting on his hip. Whereas on this side, there's a tiny little gap between his arm and the rest of his body, and you can see that this area here, it becomes difficult to read. You can't quite tell where his hand is sitting. So we might try and just make that gap a little bit bigger, something a little bit closer to this. But other than that, this is a beautiful silhouette. The other thing that we want to keep in mind while posing is what's known as the line of action. I've found this image of some old Tom and Jerry cartoons online, and these have got some really nice examples. So we're just going to have a quick look at this. So the line of action, kind of as it says here, is this imaginary line that kind of goes from the tip of a character's head down to their feet or their tail, and it draws this single line through the whole character's body. It kind of follows their spine, and it's really good for being able to show what your character is trying to do. So you can particularly tell with these drawings down on this second line here that when you do the line of action correctly, you get this nice arc going through the whole character. And it doesn't mean that every single body limb needs to follow this exactly. Like, you can see the tail here is kind of coming off at a little bit of a different angle. But it should be, generally speaking, the whole body flows through this motion. And you can see when you get it wrong, you're like, there isn't a line of action through here. Kind of getting these rigid sort of shapes going through there, from the tail up through the spine, through the head, and then it goes out at this weird angle for the baseball bat or whatever it is there. And you lose this sense of movement, this sense of power that goes through the character. And this line of action can kind of be used to demonstrate a few different things. The more you bend it, the more crazy you get those arcs, the more cartoony that your character ends up looking. So you can see this, you get this U shape or upside down U shape here. Tom here he's doing his creeping pose, and it's a really cartoony pose. Like you can't do that in real life, but the action still reads really well. If you want to make your character look a little bit more fluid in their movement, you can draw an S curve. If you want to show strength and power through a movement, you do these big arcs, or this kind of an arc down here. And then if you want to show your character being a little bit more straight, you can go for something a little bit more like this. You can see that it's not nearly arcing as much. It's almost a straight line. In fact, the example that I really love from here is this one over here, where it's almost a perfectly straight line. There's a little bit of bend in there, but the whole point here is that Tom is really pressed up against a wall, and he's rigid, and he's trying to hide. So you end up with a really straight line. So that's what these lines of action are for. So if we go back to Scorbunny here, and we draw a line of action through him, we end up with it's a fairly straight line. So again, this is kind of a power pose, hands on hips. He's looking strong, but at the same time, it's kind of got these little flicks both at the feet and at the ears, where it kind of flicks off a little bit, and that kind of shows that he's a speedy character. He's a fast character. He's one of the fastest Pokemon. And so just adding these little ticks, these little flicks to that line of action, emphasizes that although this is a strong, powerful pose, he's also fluid. He's ready to run at any given moment. So we need to keep this in mind while we work on this pose. So back in Blender here, we want to try and match this pose as closely as possible. Now we can either try and eyeball that, but alternatively, what we can do is jump over into camera view mode, and I'm just going to make sure that my camera is in fact visible. And if I just go and grab that same image off my desktop and drag that in here while we're in camera view and let go, you can see that it actually puts it, and it's attached to the camera, which is really nice. So if I jump back into perspective view, you can see we can't see it. It's only available to us in camera view. And you can see it's getting stretched a little bit here. We just need to tweak our resolution a little bit. I think about 800 by 1200 gets us something pretty close. Turn back on lock camera to view. We can just sort of line this up a little bit better. So now we can really try and follow this pose a little bit more closely. Okay, so with that finally done, let's jump over into our sculpting layout here. And I might just have to quickly set up my view here again, because I would like to be able to see this for reference, even though we do still have it in the background here. Let's go over to sculpt mode here. I might just break out of our camera view a little bit and pop this out so I can see all of my tools. And we're going to want to go and grab our lasso tool. Now, when you're doing animation, or whether that's animation or just trying to do a single pose like this, you want to take into account the way that the body moves. And it doesn't matter whether it's a human body or Scorbunny here, a bipedal creature tends to move in a fairly similar way. So for example, if Scorbunny here was to say throw a softball, you would notice in animation that his shoulder joint would move first, followed by his elbow, then followed by his hand as he goes and throws that ball. Now generally speaking, when you're talking about the entire body, it's the hips that move first on humanoid creatures. So that's the part that we're going to pose first. So I've still got X symmetry turned on here. As you can see here, we're going to break symmetry, so I'm just going to start by switching that off. And then I'm going to start by selecting the feet here. And because we've got symmetry off, we will need to make sure to select both of them. I'll just select a little bit more, because the first thing we're going to do here is move the hips. So with that selected, you can go up to mask here and you can go smooth mask. You can also use, I believe it's the keyboard shortcut A, which will bring up all of your masking options, and you can go to smooth mask from there. So I might just tap that twice. We're then going to go and grab our rotate tool in this case. And as you can see, it kind of pops it down to the center of the world there. We want it to be sitting somewhere up around the hips. So for that, you want to go to sculpt, set pivot, and go, in this case, pivot to mask border, which will set it in between our masked borders there. So if I just go and select that, you can see that it pops into place. And from here we can start to rotate the hips. So if I just go back to the camera view here, you can see that because this foot is lifted slightly off the ground, we've got a little bit of a diagonal slant going here. So let's start by lowering the hips on that side and raising them on the right side here, right side camera view anyway. And then this chest kind of points off to the left of screen a little bit. So I might rotate this around a little bit to somewhere about there, and then rotate it back. As you can see, this is kind of thrown off the rest of the body a fair bit, but as we go through the various parts of the body here, you'll see that starting here is kind of the easiest way to go. So I'll just pop out of camera view here and go around to the back and just make sure that everything is still kind of sitting okay. It's not too bad. I might just move everything forward just a touch. We just want to take into account the center of gravity here, and if we push this too far, or even rotate it too far, you can just tell that this character would fall over. So we want to try to get it so that the center of gravity is kind of over the feet a little bit here. Now obviously the head and everything isn't. This character would still fall over, but we are going to rotate a fair bit of this forward to sort of compensate. So I think I'm fairly happy with that. I might just drop back, use my grab tool and just kind of pull this backside area down a little bit, just so we get a little bit of a fold back there, and maybe just smooth it a touch. Maybe do a little bit of the same here, and you can always use Alt-M to disable your mask, or you can bring up your shortcut menu there and clear mask. So I'm just going to pull this down just a little bit, make sure that we maintain that volume through the legs. Okay, that's enough to start with. We can always come back and tweak this a little bit more later. Let's go and try to get let's try and get his upper torso into position here, because you can see that this kind of curves following that line of action that we spoke about earlier. So we're going to want to add that in. Now you might have noticed before that going through and selecting the lasso tool, selecting things, going up and smoothing, and then going and setting your pivot, there's a lot of button clicks that need to be done to achieve this, and unfortunately, at least in Blender 2.82, a lot of these things don't have keyboard shortcuts set up. So to try and get around that, I'm going to go and add them to my quick favorites here. So if you go and just right click on pretty much anything, you can go and add it to a quick favorites menu, which then brings it up in this menu here. Now I have my keyboard shortcuts set up a little bit differently, but I believe default is just hitting the Q button. You can see on mine I actually have a slightly different menu, but in my case I've got it bound to Shift Q, but I'm pretty sure default is just Q, which should bring up your quick favorites here. So you can see we've now got the lasso tool in there. I'm also going to go and add our set pivot. And I think I also want to add our move, rotate, and scale tools. So this should allow us to get to things just that little bit quicker. So now I can go and select the entire upper body here. We can bring up our shortcut masks and just smooth that a little bit. Grab our rotate tool, oops, and set our pivot properly. Let's go back into the camera view, so that we can kind of try and, oops, don't forget to invert your mask, Control I, or once again, bringing up your menu. And unfortunately, inverting that has reset our pivot point. Now, we can just tilt that around a little bit further. Excellent. Let's go and grab the lasso tool, clear our mask, go and try to get the head into place. Now from this angle I can't actually get the entire back of the head, so make sure that you try and get this from all angles. And also just kind of noticing, now that we've got this sort of lined up a little bit, that our head just feels just a little bit small. So I'm also going to go and grab the scale tool here and just scale that head up just a smidge. And then maybe shift it back into place. Keeping in mind that I don't want to move it around too much, otherwise we're going to end up with some kind of weird bulging down here, which is okay. We can come in and just smooth it, but we do still want to try and minimize it. Okay, so that's kind of it in terms of moving body parts around. So I'm just going to go ahead and push this over to a speed sculpt, and I'll come back to you with the final result. Okay, so the one thing that I've had a little bit of trouble sculpting here, and it doesn't matter whether we use the regular sculpting tools or whether we try to use masking or even try it with the pose brush, is to try and get these ears to sort of curve offwards. It's easy enough to just kind of shift them, but then you get this kind of weird bend through them, and we really want this to be a nice smooth curve. So rather than doing this with sculpting, I thought let's explore using lattices or mesh deformers. So let's drop back into layout mode here and drop out of camera view. And I'm just going to go and use shift right click to go and place my cursor on the ear here and go and grab a cube. And that's obviously way too big, so let's shrink him down to somewhere about there. And just so this is a little bit easier to see, I'm going to go to viewport display here and change this to wireframe. And now we want to try and align this to the ear a little bit better. And we can go in here and reshape things and extrude edges to give us something a little bit easier to work with. I'm just going to leave that at 4 edge loops. And we just want to make sure that we're not accidentally grabbing the other ear over here. So let's shift this across a little bit. Just scale that so that fits a little bit better. That looks reasonably okay. Let's maybe just shift this back a little bit, shift that back a little bit, and make sure that we go and grab an edge over here and pull this out to make sure that we get this little tuft in there as well. And that's probably enough detail. We don't need terribly much here to make this work. So now let's select our Scorbunny mesh and go and add a mesh deformer. Use our eyedropper tool here to select what used to be our cube and just go bind. And now when we go into edit mode, you should be able to just grab vertices here and shift things around, and you can see that everything moves underneath. So just so we've got a little bit more control over this, I'm going to go and add a shapes key to this. And this just allows us to dial it in or completely remove it, just in case we're not happy with our final result. So I'm going to go back to our camera view here and make sure that camera view is locked. I'm just going to zoom in on here, and let's go and try and put this in place. So I think that's looking okay. You can see we have ripped a few vertices off here, but this is all right. We should be able to fix any of this stuff in a final sculpt. Okay, so now we can just go back to our modifiers here and just go and apply that. We can then delete that and just go back into sculpt mode and just smooth that little bit of a weird deformation out. And maybe just round out that little bend there just a little bit more. And I might just make this pinch a little bit as it comes towards the end. I'm just going to go and mask out the rest of that so that doesn't get in the way while I'm pinching here. Just go back to our view. That's not too bad. It doesn't match perfectly, but that's okay. We can get that pretty close. Okay, I'm reasonably happy with that. Let's shift over to doing the other ear, and that's just going to be the exact same process. Okay, I think I'm getting pretty happy with this. You can certainly spend a lot more time on this if you felt like it, and really refine some of this. But I think for our purposes, this is going to be close enough. So now that we've got a pose set up, I'm just going to quickly go in and tweak some of our lights here, and just make sure that we get a nice final result. Now, I'm not 100% happy with the fur here, particularly around his belly. I'm just noticing it's starting to look like it's just a little bit too long. So I'm just going to go in and tweak some of these fur settings before we finish this off. And of course, we can't forget his little neck jewel thing here. And at that point, I think I'm pretty happy with our final result here. So that's going to do it for this tutorial. Remember, there's going to be one last tutorial where we're going to take this exact same setup here, and we're going to tweak the fur ever so slightly so that we can do a final render in cycles. So I will see you for that.